Welcome back to another video. We're out here at Staten Island Airfield, and today we're going to be doing two things. The first and the most important part of this video is going to be finally giving my review of the DJI Goggles 2. And that is incredibly relevant because I've actually recorded this video once, and then DJI released a firmware update which fixed one really specific issue that I harped on quite a bit in my original review. But it's now better, apparently. We're actually going to test it too in this video. And then second, we're actually going to do a quick first flight with the Grinderino. Built up my 3-inch replacement for that skylight, and so we're gonna give it a whirl, see how she flies, and you're gonna see the DVR of me taking off with it. So without further ado, let me get the Goggles 2 on, and we'll get up in the air, and we're gonna talk about them. So give me a second, and we'll get up and flying. Goggles are on, drone is plugged in, let's get up in the air before this little guy overheats. Ooh, that's spicy sounding. Woo! And the Grinderino is off. That's actually not too bad. Props are very much in view, and you see the little hooks on the top of the frame. So let's start out with the positives for the Goggles 2. First and foremost, the weight and the form factor. The weight of the Goggles 2 is like half of what the V2 and V1 goggles were. It means that both when you're traveling with them, they're physically lighter in your bag, which is great, and they're also smaller, so they pack in a little nicer. Also, it means when they're on your face, they're a little lighter. I think that is such a big advantage if you're gonna be flying for a long time, because that extra weight dragging down on your neck, providing extra stress and strain on your head, it's not great. These are much more in line with the traditional FPV goggle size that you'd find from Walk Snail, Fat Shark, Orca, all of those traditional FPV goggles that are super light and very, very comfortable. As far as the weight goes, these goggles are very, very comfortable, and I think the improvement on the weight is a huge, huge welcome advantage to the Goggles 2 over the Goggles V1 and V2. Second major change with the Goggles 2 that I think is a big pro is the original antenna layout. So the goggles have two omnidirectional antennas in the front and then two little flip-up omnidirectional antennas on top. Because everything is internal, everything folds down, unlike the Goggles V2, which have the sticky outy screw-on SMA antennas on the top and bottom, these can fold away, pack away so simply and easily. I think it is a massive advantage to their portability and flexibility when it comes to packing them away and traveling with them. Not completely an advantage, but we're gonna get into that a little bit later in this video. The next big pro for the Goggles 2 is the screens. Unlike the Goggles V1 and V2, these use an OLED screen. And OLED screens are just richer color, they're more vibrant, they have deeper blacks, better contrast ratio. There is nothing in the picture quality that I can really say is a downgrade from the Goggles V1 and V2. The one advantage that the Goggles V1 and V2 have is because that screen is a little flatter, a little bit less saturated. It is a little easier in in high contrast environments to get a better idea of what you're visually staring at. So I do find sometimes I miss the dynamic range, I guess, that is found on those displays, which can make it a little easier flying, like say through trees where there's a huge fluctuation between super bright and super dark. But overall, I think the performance of these new screens is fantastic. Same goes with the actual latency of the screens. It is not better than the Goggles V1 and V2, but the latency of these screens is fantastic. Latency and transmission, excellent. And actually to that same end, I actually don't feel I need to change out the factory antennas. My performance that I seem to get with the Goggles 2 is actually pretty similar to what I get with the Goggles V2, running True RC antenna stubbies on top, and then the iFlight crystal antennas, the patch ones that go right over the goggle eyepiece looking thing. With the performance being similar to the aftermarket antennas that are on the Goggles V2 that I use, I really haven't felt any need to upgrade the antennas. The last big pro for the Goggles 2 is that it is compatible with the original FPV system. There are some hitches to that, which again we'll get into in a second, which I feel like a lot of these pros have kind of a gotcha to them. But overall, I think the performance of the backwards compatibility on the Vista and original Air unit is great. The image quality of the video coming back to the goggles is very, very good. And now, in firmware that was literally released 2 days before I recorded this, they now auto record. That was one sticking point in the original version of this video that was super frustrating, is when you were using the Goggles 2 with a Vista original Air unit, it would not auto record the DVR on the goggles. You had to swipe down on the little touchpad on the side, select the record option up at the top, and then swipe it away before you fly every time. I cannot tell you how many times I landed after recording a video, thought I had it, thought I had a backup, and I did not, because the goggles didn't auto record, because that was not a feature that was working. Super, super frustrating. It is now patched, so it is a little better, but I feel like that's the case with a lot of things with DJI, is you always get something that you want, but it always comes with a catch that you may not want. Let's now talk about the cons of the Goggles 2. The first big con of the Goggles 2 is actually in relation to the Integra. And while I personally don't want to have GPS on my goggles, if you're a person that flies the Avata, that flies any of the Mavic or mini camera drones from DJI, or you now can fly the FPV Potato, the Goggles Integra have a built-in GPS chip that allows you to fly those drones and be compliant with their mandatory remote ID without having to plug your phone in. And having an additional cable running up to your goggles, I feel would be kind of annoying. Since I don't fly the Avata and I don't fly the Potato, and I don't really intend on using my Goggles 2 with any of the standard DJI drones, for me this is not a big deal. I prefer being able to swap out my battery, which is a big con for the Integras, and have some of the extra features that are in the Goggles 2. So if you do fly the Integras, if you do fly the Avata or other DJI drone products that are not the Air units, I would recommend taking a strong look at the Integras, because they're basically the Goggles 2. They just have that additional feature of the GPS being built in. For me, the biggest con with the DJI goggles is their fit and feel. I can get them comfortable on my face. I've tried both the standard foam, I've tried the iFlight foam, and I've tried now the $35 DJI soft fit foam. All of them are okay. They have their pluses, they have their disadvantages for each one of them, and that's going to be completely individual to each individual person. So unless you have the exact same face shape as me, my opinions on that really don't make a ton of difference. I will say though that the soft foam for DJI is not the most comfortable. The actual feel of the material on my face, I much prefer the foam from Newbie Drone, from iFlight, and the original DJI like silicone face mask. Because of these different foam options, I can get the goggles comfortable on my face, but that kind of means I have to make other compromises. And what I mean by that is I have to choose between complete comfort of the foam, whether or not I can see and get in focus the entirety of the display in the goggles, or have a little bit of light leak. And for me, the worst two are the feel on the face and the light leak. So I'm kind of willing to compromise a little bit on having the entire screen in focus, because usually I am focused on the center of the display, but it is a little disappointing that there's a good chunk of the screen, especially the part that has the OSD on it, that isn't necessarily in focus perfectly. This is super frustrating, and I think it's down to the distance of my eyes to the optics and then the optics to the screen. There's something about those distances that is not perfect for me. This is not going to be the case with everybody, but I have heard a lot of other creators and a lot of other people who fly these goggles that have this same issue. It is not an issue for me with Fat Shark. It's not an issue for me with the Walk Snail goggles. HD0 I can get in focus. Pretty much every other goggle I've flown, I haven't had this issue. Since there are so many issues with the fit for so many different faces and so many different people, I do think this is a pretty big con and something that's not present in a lot of other goggles. Another thing that isn't quite as good as the Goggles V2 is the controls. On the Goggles 2, everything is controlled with this little touchpad on the side of the goggle, and it's okay. It works, it's functional, and you do get used to it for the most part. Overall, I wish they had stuck with the traditional little nubbin control that you find on the goggles V2 and V1. It's just so much easier, it's so much quicker, and if I have to make a change to a setting quickly, it works easier. The touchpad is okay, it's fine, but I do think overall it's a con. That's why I think with the Integra, they went back to the little jog stick. It may be a case of it's cheaper, but also I think it's because it works better. I still feel that the software in these goggles is not great. There are a lot of weird quirks with these goggles, a lot of incompatibility with previous generations of goggles, when realistically it seems like it's more of a DJI software issue than any kind of hardware issue that would keep people being able to spectate with the goggles V1 or V2 on the Goggles 2 or Integras. But there are a lot of incompatibilities with the goggles to the air unit depending on what firmware you're running. And I specifically say that because the firmware that you're running dictates whether or not you can bind certain goggles to certain air units and spectate certain air units with certain goggles. It's a complete nightmare mess. I'm gonna link down below a video from Mads Tech who goes through and explains kind of the complicated nature of the way the system works when it comes to compatibility. But it is frustrating, and it's frustrating how hard it is to explain, because I think that adds a huge amount of unnecessary confusion to a product that should be pretty simple. It should just be able to bind, work, and you should be good to go. In that same vein of software, the resolution and frame rate of your camera set on the air unit is the same one that's transmitted. And that's an issue because, say if you select 60 frames per second and 4K, which is great for editing and great for recording if you're posting content, you're actually not going to be in low latency mode. If, say, you want to record in 30 frames per second at 1080, you're also not in low latency mode. On the Goggles 2, the only way you get into low latency mode is if you set the frame rate to 100 frames per second in any of the resolutions. So 1080, 2.7K, or 4K. If you set the frame rate to 100 frames per second, which is what it will record on the air unit as well as on the goggles, then you're in low latency mode. For me, this wasn't a huge problem on the Goggles 2 because those actually supported that low latency mode on 120 frames per second. So I could set it to 120 frames per second recording on the air unit, and when you just have to reduce it by a factor of 2 or 4, so if you're putting it into a 4K timeline, you're just reducing 120 to 60, dividing by 2, or dividing by 4 if, say, you wanted to put it into a 30 frames per second timeline. 100 frames per second is not as easy to deal with unless you're, say, shooting high frame rate for PAL, which is frustrating. The reason this is the case is because the goggles, because they have that OLED screen, are limited in their output frame rate to 100 frames per second. It's the case pretty much with every single OLED screen. It's why you see that frame rate pop up in pretty much every other goggle, from HD0 to Walk Snail. All of them use that same 100 frames or 90 frames per second cap when they're running in goggles that have OLED screens. And that is just a limit of the technology. There's really nothing that can be done about that on the hardware model. It would be nice though if for the recording part of it on the air unit, you could adjust your resolution and frame rate separately. I would love to be able to record 30 frames per second on the air unit and then transmit in low latency mode at 100 frames per second to the goggles. Right now, that's just currently not possible with any of the systems, so the frame rate itself is a real bummer. Can you work around it? Absolutely. For me, still a con. It's still one of the most frustrating elements of the Goggles 2. The last big con for me is their expandability, compatibility, and future-proofing, I guess we'll call it. On most of the other goggles, you have stuff like inputs and outputs to output video via a standard, whether it's HDMI or the analog signal cables, something like that. You also have, in a lot of cases, the goggles are able to have another receiver plugged in, so you can use it for not only just the system you bought the goggles for, but you can add an additional, like the HD Zeros, you can throw a Walk Snail VRX in, so now you have kind of two goggles in one. DJI works with DJI, that's it. With the Goggles V2, you could add the analog adapter, which was a really nice compatibility feature that, I mean, they didn't need to add, but it was so nice that they did. The Goggles 2 are so much more locked down. They really are about as proprietary as a goggle gets. It's what you kind of expect from DJI. And there we go. That really rounds out the pros and cons for the DJI Goggles 2. Ignoring the fact that their name is confusing and that the fit and feel is not great, if you are primarily flying DJI, I think they are a fantastic goggle, but I don't know that I would necessarily race out an upgrade, especially if you have a Goggle V2, because I think the Goggle V2 is actually still my favorite goggle from a standpoint of the fit, performance, as well as expandability. I think the Goggles V2 is probably still the best goggle DJI has made, and if you already have one, I would say stick with it. If you're looking to come into a digital system and you're looking at potentially getting in on DJI, I would take a strong look at walk snail before you pull the trigger. When you're flying freestyle, you're gonna break stuff, you're gonna have crashes, and the DJI O3 Air unit is not super repairable. Whereas the walk snail stuff is a little bit less expensive, it's a little bit more expandable even. You can switch out cameras, you have different options. DJI is a very closed down system now. It used to feel a little bit more open when you had aftermarket companies like RunCam and not Foxeer. Actually, I think Foxeer did make a camera. But at least RunCam and CatX, they made aftermarket cameras for the DJI system. And I feel like that really has gone by the wayside with the O3 system, and I don't see it getting any better. So because of that flexibility of the system, because of the cost of the components, and to be honest, I don't think DJI is going to continue to make the Vista for that much longer. And I don't think the O3 is necessarily the best freestyle FPV system because A, it's cost, and B, I mean, just the weird low latency mode stuff is kind of frustrating. I think walk snail is probably the best bet for those getting into and wanting to start in a digital FPV system. If you're planning on racing or you fly a lot of whoops, I would also highly recommend taking a look at HD0. I think overall the package from them is a lot better. And tying into that, you can actually plug a walk snail VRX into the HD0 goggles, and now you have two goggles for one price. I think the person who's going to benefit most from the Goggles 2 is somebody who's flying DJI primarily and pretty much only. If they are flying something else, they already have a set of additional goggles. If you're flying DJI products primarily and almost only, take a strong look at that Integra, because having two cables plugged into your goggles all the time gonna get old real fast, I promise you. And for those that are interested in racing and whoops, go take a look at HD0. I think that's the best digital system for you. Walk snail is a close second, but it's just not quite as light or quite as flexible and high, whatever it's called. The frame rate and latency is a little bit higher on walk snail compared to HD0, but that's neither here nor there. This is about the Goggles 2. And last, before I close this video out, the Grinderino flew fantastic. I really liked it. And also the auto record now works on the practice drone. So that is a huge relief. And I really appreciate that DJI is listening at least a little bit to the community and giving us something that we want. Overall, the Goggles 2, I would give kind of a lukewarm thumbs up. Not perfect, not a terrible product, somewhere in between. And it's definitely not their best goggle they've ever made. So with all that said, thank you for joining me on this video. Down below, there's affiliate links to all the stuff I've talked about in this video. Using them doesn't cost you anything, just help support this channel. As always, leave me a comment. Let me know, have you flown the Goggles 2? Do you care? Or what HD system are you flying now? I'd love to know how many people have jumped from DJI over to walk snail. I don't think that's a small number because I have a lot of friends who used to fly DJI and quite a few have flipped. And if you liked the video, give me a thumbs up, helps in the algorithm. And if you want to see more videos like this, please hit the subscribe button. Once again, helps me in the algorithm. Catch you in the next video, guys. Bye.